Welcome to this comprehensive course on OpenAI's Assistance API, which allows developers to build powerful AI assistants capable of performing a variety of tasks. This course covers essential topics like integrating the API for advanced functionalities, leveraging its knowledge retrieval and code interpretation capabilities, and understanding the fundamentals of large language models. Through hands-on projects with Streamlit and real-world examples, you'll gain practical skills to build responsive, AI-enhanced applications. By the end, you'll be able to use the Assistance API to transform your web apps into dynamic, smart platforms.
Hello and welcome to this course. My name is Paulo Dishon. I am a software engineer, so I teach people how to become software engineers, developers, and build applications. And I've also taught over 250,000 students on various skills from programming, build apps, AI, as well as cloud engineering. So welcome to this course. The next question is, what is it that you're going to be learning in this course? Well, in this course, you're going to be learning about the Assistance API. Essentially, you're going to learn about function calls, you're going to learn about retrieval mechanisms, and of course, you're going to be building a lot of stuff going through this course, because that is how I like to introduce certain concepts to my students. So that's part of what you're going to be expecting in this course. And of course, I'll be talking about large language models, embeddings, and all these things that relate to AI specifically. Okay, now let's talk about the prerequisites for this course. So I expect you to at least have the basics of programming. Of course, I don't expect you to be an expert or anything, as long as you have some fundamentals of programming, be it JavaScript or any other modern-ish programming language, you should be fine going through this course. And one thing to keep in mind is that unfortunately, this is not a one-on-one programming course. I'm not going to teach you how to program. Rather, I'll focus on the big picture idea of Assistance API and large language models. So we're going to be using Python in this course. So if you have never used Python, you don't even know what Python is, that's okay. That's not the main thing here. The main thing is that I want you to understand how this technology, how Assistance API, and how large language models, how AI-based applications are built. That is the main goal here. So don't worry, you'll be fine as long as you want to learn and you follow along what I'm going to be doing. The other thing also, remember that you'll have access to all of that code in the description below. Okay, now let's go ahead and look into Python setup and essentially the environment setup so that you can follow along with this course. Now, keep in mind, if you already have Python set up on your machine and you have Visual Studio Code or any other code editor that you use, obviously you don't have to follow along because you have all that, right? So if you don't have that, then I'm going to show you right now what you need to do, what you need to install on your machine. That way you are able to follow along in this course. Now, the best place I found online where you are able to go through tutorials on how to set up Python specifically on your machine, whether it's Windows, Mac, Linux, and so forth, is this link here, which I'm going to show you right now. Let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so if you go to this link here, which is kingstar.com, knowledge base, install Python, this does everything that you will ever need, or at least has all of the instructions you need to install Python if you don't have Python installed on your machine. Okay, so just go ahead and follow exactly what they have here, and they even tell you what is Python, which is kind of nice, and all the things that you need. Okay, so just follow along. And the great thing is that you can go through these different links here. So how to install Python on Windows. If you're on Windows, click here. That will take you to this setup. And how to install Python on Mac OS, that will take you through this whole setup that you need to go through. And of course, if you're very special and are on Linux, go ahead and click here and just follow the instructions. So it's really straightforward. I don't see any value in me going through all of this with you. So go ahead and get that set up if you don't have Python set up on your machine, and we'll go from there. So the next thing we will need is an IDE, an integrated development environment. I use Visual Studio Code, which is what I'm going to be using in this course. So if you have something else that you use, that's totally fine, go with that, but go ahead and download that if you don't have it. So it's very simple. You can go to Visual Studio Code, And depending on your machine, for me, I'm on Mac, it just goes straight to download Mac Universal. You can click here and you can see that we have Mac OS Universal, Windows, Linux, and all of this. Okay, so depending on your situation, just go ahead and download the version, the latest version of VS Code, and you should be ready to go. Okay, now because of the nature of what we're going to be learning in this course, which is OpenAI Assistance API, you will need to have an OpenAI account. That is very important for obvious reasons. And so particularly what you need to do is you need to go ahead and create, in this case, have an API key, because that's what will allow us to use the Assistance API and various things we can do with OpenAI APIs and so forth. So that is very important. So let me show you real quick here. So if you type in openai.com, as you see here, make this a little bit larger, you'll be able to say log in. So click here. If you don't have an OpenAI account, you can go ahead and say sign up. If you already have one, you can just put your email and go ahead and sign in. Also, you can go ahead and say continue with Google, with Microsoft account, or with Apple. So I already have an account, but in this case, you can go ahead and sign up. Okay, so I'm going to say continue with Google. I think you can also go that route to create an account, and it gives you this opportunity here to choose between going to ChatGPT or going to API. We want to go to API, and this is what's going to open. So this will take us to this main view here. So there's a lot of things, a lot of capabilities, get started and all that. What we really want to go to is to go to Assistance API, which actually we're going to do that later. But what we want right now is to go to API key. So click here on API keys. You can see that I have one API key, which I created a little bit ago. So go ahead and say create an API key, and you can name this Assist API key. You can name it whatever you want, and that API key, click there to create this API key. And then what you need to do is copy this API key by clicking here and save this API key for later in this course once we get started coding into all these things. So it's very important to not to share this with anyone. In fact, after I've created this, I'm going to delete this so that way you can't use it. Okay, so save it in a very safe place. That way you don't lose it. Okay, make sure that once you close that window, just like I said, there is no other way for you to access it to get it again. So that's why I wanted you to save it. Okay, but you can create as many secret keys as you need. So if you for some reason didn't copy that, you can go ahead and create a new one and go from there. So that should be it about setting up your API environment, understanding what we're going to be doing in this course, as well as having your API keys set up or created for us to be able to use that in this course. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at what is this thing called Assistance API. The Assistance API is a tool built by the OpenAI folks that allows developers to easily craft and build AI-based applications that leverage the OpenAI environment, the OpenAI platform per se. So the thing to understand about the Assistance API is that it's not its own entity per se, although it is, but it is attached or extends, in this case, what we know, the OpenAI API, which includes all of the tools and models that power ChatGPT and many other underlying infrastructure of the OpenAI environment. So that is the important distinction here, is that when we talk about the Assistance API, it extends what already is there, in this case, the OpenAI API. And so it makes it easier for us to build AI tools, in this case, AI assistants that we can use in our applications. So essentially gives us this platform, this framework, this libraries to quickly use these tools to build any application, AI-based application that we would want to build without having to know too much about the underlying abstraction of how things actually work. So essentially we can go ahead and create an assistant and use the API so that we can connect that assistant in our application and use that assistant that has the capability of connecting with the OpenAI APIs essentially. Now, the next thing we need to look at is, for this Assistance API, what is the problem that it solves? Now, the thing to understand is that building applications in general, let alone building AI-based applications, it's a very hard task for developers because it's very complex. There are usually a lot of moving parts that a developer needs to focus on. Developers need to manage, in this case, certain infrastructures. They need to keep in mind how the data is being used, which models are needed to use, in this case, to power their applications. They have to learn how to craft the best prompts possible in order to communicate with these large language models. And they also need to understand or keep track of the application state, understand about embeddings, which is something totally different, but it is part of this realm of AI and large language models, and understand the storage mechanism, right? How do we upload files? How does the large language model use those files to allow us to tap into the main knowledge, but also those files retrieval, those files knowledge, but also retrieve information from those files, and so many things, right? So this is not easy. It's a very complex thing to carry as a developer. This poses a problem for developers because now developers, instead of focusing on building the actual application, now they're focusing on how to stitch all these pieces together to make this work. So the benefit of using the Assistance API is that all of this complexity, all of these things that developers need to know or to deal with, it's abstracted out, which means they don't have to deal with it anymore because now the Assistance API, the backend of everything, is taken care of. All we need to do as developers now is to focus on what matters, which is build our application. So the Assistance API already has all the things that we need as developers, but we don't need to think about them because it abstracts out all of that work. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about large language models, is that they by themselves, they don't have a state, which means they don't save a context of a conversation per se. Now with the Assistance API, we don't have that problem because there is this thing called the persistent threading for ongoing conversation. What this means is now we're able to save messages and the context of that messages. That way, let's say if you're creating a bot, you don't have to yourself save that context so that then when you ask a certain question that the bot needs to know about the previous conversation, the bot will actually know what it's referring to because it has the context. Okay, that's huge because now we don't have to worry about that. The Assistance API has that built in. And also we have the retrieval mechanisms for digging through data. So what this means is that we can upload files for the models to use for additional knowledge base. So you can upload files about something, let's say about cryptocurrency. So now that piece of knowledge is added to the main base knowledge, right, that comes with the large language model. That way you can converse with the large language model in addition to the knowledge that we just added by uploading certain files, documents, and so forth. So now we have a more flexible and more knowledgeable, if I may say, large language model because we are aiding it with retrieval mechanisms. It also has code interpreters, so it actually writes, can analyze code, and do all sort of things, which is amazing, as you will see, okay? One of the biggest things that we now get with Assistance API is that we can actually do function calling. What that means is that when our assistant is solving a problem, we ask a question, the assistant will be able to call a function that we specify that will be used as a tool to go and fetch certain data that the large language model needs to solve a certain problem. And that is huge because now, in addition to uploading files for retrieval mechanisms and so forth, we can also add more tools by adding these functions that go serve as agents that can go and do something else and bring back the results, which are going to be used by the large language model, in this case the OpenAI API per se, or the assistant, right, to solve the problem or to answer accurately what you are asking it for. That's pretty awesome, mind-blowing. Let me show you the diagram here real quick so you can see visually the Assistance API benefits. So if you look at this diagram here, right, the assistants can go ahead and call the OpenAI models, right, to tune their personality, in this case, their capabilities. also these assistants can also access multiple tools in parallel. So now it's sort of having these agents that can go and do stuff and bring back the results so that we can help the assistant to be a better assistant, right? So in this case here, these are tools. The tools that we have here, we talked about the code interpreter. We have the knowledge retrieval, right? Files and documents we can upload so that our assistant is more knowledgeable about certain topic. As well, function calling. Now, the great thing about a function calling is that we can it's a way for us to create our own tools on top of the tools that the assistant already has access to, such as the code interpreter, knowledge retrieval, and so forth. So now with this, we can create our own tools, right? Our own functions that go, for instance, and fetch the current situation in Bulgaria, or go and fetch some sort of data in a database somewhere. You get the idea. And along with everything that I said, we have these persistent threads. The threads we'll talk about in a second here allows us to have these messages that we are saving or are being saved in our conversation. And so those are saved for context, which is huge, because remember, all large language models, they don't have a concept of saving history per se. So they're stateless. So they don't have a way of saving the context, which is problematic when we want to refer to a certain concept that was talked about. If they're not saving that history, then it wouldn't know what you're referring to. So context is very important, and that is all given with the Assistance API. Okay, and of course we can access files in several formats. So this is a diagram I wanted to show you about the benefits of the Assistance API. Now, most like, of course, you've heard of the chat completion API, which is the one that you've been using if you were using the OpenAI API, right? So you just send messages and you receive a response. And it's very useful because the completion API, it goes straight to the OpenAI models and asks questions, and the large language models, and of course the knowledge base. But the thing here is that this knowledge base is a knowledge base that is already there. There's no addition, meaning if you were to ask certain questions about something that was done or happened after September 2023, I believe, right? Anything that was done after that, then this large language model here wouldn't have that knowledge base, so it would just say, I don't know. Because the completion API is just a way for us to get direct response. Okay, that is the difference here between the chat completion API, which is useful, with the Assistance API, as I have discussed earlier. Okay, so let's look at this general comparison so we can see the differences between the Assistance API and the Chat Completions API. Okay, this is just to have some sort of an overall idea. So you can see here the aspect column and the Assistance API, the Chat Completion API. So for Assistance API, initial setup, you have to create an assistant with defined capabilities, which we'll see in a little bit. For chat completion, of course, there's nothing for you to set up. You just call the API and get the results, the answers, and so forth. For the Assistance API, we have to initiate and manage, in this case, a thread for ongoing conversation. We'll talk about what a thread is and all that stuff in a little bit. And for the chat completion, of course, we have none of that. So this is just to show you the differences between the Assistance API and the Chat Completions API. And you can go down here to complexity, so more complex setup, of course, for the Assistance API, and it's simpler, of course, for the Chat Completions API. Okay, so no need to memorize this. This is just something you can take a screenshot of and then go ahead and just take a look to see the differences between the Assistance API and the Chat Completions API. Okay, and there you have it. All right, so we just finished looking at the benefits of the Assistance API and how it works and how it facilitates our lives as developers so that we can focus on actually building those AI-based tools, right? Instead of worrying about the underlying infrastructure things that we would have to do if we didn't have assistance. So now let's look at the Assistance API, the building blocks, because we talked a lot about the underlying infrastructure, how it works, the benefits. Let's go ahead and look inside and see what are the building blocks of an assistant. Right? So here is a diagram. I like having diagrams because it hopefully helps you conceptualize these ideas. The Assistance API has about 4 main building blocks. So first, you see that we can have, in this case, an assistant. So the assistant itself is, in this case, the entity, the thing per se that we actually build, which we'll then use to help us get information about certain topic. And so in this case here, we can have an example, an assistant who is a travel agent bot that we can use. So that is the first component. And the second component, or second building block, is what we call threads. A thread is where all of the messages that occur between the assistant and the user, because that is the whole idea, all those messages are tracked here in the thread. So in this case here, a user may have a message that say, hey, what is the cost for an extra day in Paris? Okay, so that is a message that is going to be on a thread, which the assistant will have access to, as well as the user. And then the assistant's message would be the cost is 12,890, for instance, right? But then you will ask, okay, there is the assistant's message, but how does the assistant know? Well, the whole process has to go through the other piece here, the other building block, which is the run entity. So the running entity needs to have a few things for it to be able to run those queries, those questions, essentially evaluate what's going on. So there is this dialogue per se that's happening. So in this case here, the run, as you can see here, has to have access to the assistant. In this case, you will see later, it's just going to be an ID. It also has to have access, or has to have a reference to the thread, because that's where all the messages are. So in this case here, the assistant is going to be our travel agent bot, and the thread is trip to Paris, for instance. And then inside of this run, the run can be triggered to then run different steps to get to that conclusion, or to get to the result. What would happen is, if you look at all of this, we have in this case the assistant, the number one building block. We have thread, that is the number two building block. Inside of the thread, that's where we have the message. So messages, or message, that's the number three building block. And number four is the actual run entity. Okay? And so how would all of this work? Well, we have the assistant, and inside of the assistant we have the thread. We have a message from the user. What is the cost for an extra day in Paris? That is going to be sent to run, which will have the assistant ID as well as the thread ID, because it needs to know where to pull those messages that are coming in from, right? And then it's going to go through a process. Steps. Number one, use code interpreter if that's what needed to calculate things. And then it's going to go ahead and create a message. And if need be, this is the beauty, it's going to be able to go and call any other tool that may be needed in order to get the correct response. And the response is going to be as a message, which is going to be returned back again to our thread. Does it make sense? So the thread is where all the action really is being dumped into, the history per se, right? And there we go. And now the thread will have the assistance message, because all the steps are done. We have the response, and it goes back as a message, assistance message, which then we can use that to show in our application. These are the assistance API building blocks. Now, it's very important here because it can be a little bit tricky at first to really conceptualize the idea. The assistant itself needs thread. A thread, that's where all the messages go. Just think of a bucket of messages, right? And then the entity run here, this is where the running of things, to go and fetch things, go through these steps, this is where it happened. The run needs to have reference to the assistant, because it needs to know who is this assistant. Because remember, the assistant will have all of the specifications that it needs, so it knows what it specializes in. In this case, is a travel agent bot. So the run needs to have a piece, in this case, a reference to these assistants. So when it goes and starts running the steps, it knows what knowledge base it needs, as well as other tools to indeed create those messages back. So the assistance messages are all here, so that we can then use those messages to show in our applications and so forth. All right, so very simple, but can be complex to wrap your head around. Understand and conceptualize these building blocks, then what's coming next is not going to be too complicated. Okay, so rewatch this part if you need to, but I think you should be good. So what we'll do next is we're going to go in the dashboard, in the playground, and look at creating an assistant manually. And later, of course, we're going to do that using code. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. So now let's go and log in into the OpenAI dashboard. So you should have an account and everything now. When you log in, this is more or less what you're going to be seeing. So what we want to do is we want to hover over here if you don't see that. So if you click here, this is what you're going to be seeing. I'm going to hover over and we're going to go to assistance, but this is where we need to go. So click here. And sometimes it takes some time. It looks like incorrect. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Okay, there we go. So today we've been having some issues, but just refresh if you're having some issues. Okay, so once you're here, let's go ahead and create our first assistant. So you can go ahead and say create here or from here, doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and create. And the first thing we need to do is to add a name. So let's say this is going to be personal trainer as such. And then we need to pass or add the instructions. So because it's an assistant, we need to say, okay, you are X, Y, and Z. You're knowledgeable in this area and so forth. Okay. I have the instructions here. So I'm just going to paste it in here and I'm going to click here to make it a little bit larger. So this says you are the best personal trainer and nutritionist who knows how to get clients to build lean muscles. You've trained high caliber athletes and movie stars, because that is exactly what we all are striving to be. Okay, so there we go. So these are the instructions. Of course, you will want to put as many instructions as a prompt, really, as you need for your assistants. So if specify exactly what you want your assistants to help you with. Okay, I'm going to go back. And next, we're going to choose the model, right? The OpenAI model that we're going to be using. There are a few, and as of recording of this video, we have the GPT-4 preview. And of course, these numbers will change depending on when you're going to be watching this video. Okay. But just remember that the concepts of how this works, that's what really matters instead of things that may change here. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the GPT 3.5 Turbo. That should be fine for now. And it's a little bit cheaper as well. So you are more than welcome to go to the higher. So I'm going to just use that one. Really? That's fine. And then we have the tools. We talked about the tools. So these allow us to attach certain things that we want this assistant to be able to do if it doesn't already have those tools, right? So we have here retrieval, we have the code interpreter, and we can add functions as well. Okay, so we don't need anything. I'm just going to go ahead and toggle the code interpreter just because why not? Okay, and anything else we can just leave as is. And I'm going to say save as such. So now the assistant was created. And if I get rid of this and get rid of that, and we can see that we do have our personal trainer. So there is the instructions and the ID. So this is very important because remember the diagram I was showing you earlier was that when things start running, when we have that fourth component or building block, which is the run, it needs to know this personal trainer, or in this case, the assistant. So this is an ID that will be used internally. Later, we're going to be able to generate or create assistants using code, which I'm going to show you, but I just want to give you an overview right now. So very important, these IDs are going to be used. And from here, you can see we can go and say test. So if you click here, this will open a different tab as you see here. And then you can test it out to see if this actually works. For instance, you can enter a message. Remember, this is the message. In this case, will be the user message. If I show you exactly this assistance API building blocks, this is what we've set up. So we have the assistant, which in this case, we said is travel agent bot, but in this case is our trainer, personal trainer. And we have thread, which we haven't created yet. It hasn't been created, but we will create. All of this is going to be created in the back end once we start running things. And then we have the messages, which is now the user's message is exactly what we pass here. Okay. So let's say I want to build muscles. What foods should I eat? I'm going to go ahead and say run. Haha. Run. What do you think it's supposed to do? Well, what's going to happen now when we run, first of all, that message, the moment we say run, the message will be added to thread. Aha. And you can see it even says a thread here, right? So the thread right now is empty. If I say run, it's going to go ahead and add that message, and the instructions is showing here. And there's a lot of things that's happening here. So let me go ahead and go through everything. I'm going to just make this, probably can't make that smaller. That's okay. And one thing you can see here, this is the thread, and each thread that is created, because it is indeed a simple message, right? And each thread that is created has also an ID. This will make sense later. So you can see here, we have all information. So the thread is where all the messages are going to be from, in this case, our user, the question that we ask, as well as when we run and come back, we should have the personal trainer, the message as well. Just like what I showed you here. This run went ahead and pulled in the assistant ID internally, and then the thread ID internally, and then went through the steps and spit out the assistance message, which now we can see here is the message, right? This is the assistant, says personal trainer. That's the name of our assistant, and says to build muscles, lean muscles. That is, it's important to focus on balanced diet. That includes blah, 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 protein-rich foods, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, healthy fats, dairy products, and all this great stuff. It even gives us a little recommendation here. And note, it's important to consult with a healthcare professional and all that great stuff. Very cool. This is what's happening, right? So essentially it goes back to what I showed you earlier. Going back here, you can also see that we have logs. Now, this is really cool because it allows us to look at exactly what happens. So you can see here, we can hide logs. We don't want to hide the logs right now because I want to show you something. So for our logs here, look at what happened. The moment we said run, what happens is that a thread was created. Indeed, because we need a thread where all the messages are going to be in. Just like, again, what I showed you here. Okay, this is good. Okay, so if we open here, you can see exactly what happens. So the thread was created, and we have a response, which is indeed the thread ID. And this ID here is exactly the same as this, because this is the thread ID that was created. Okay. And we have some other metadata. That's okay. And then we added a message to that thread. The message was the one that we wrote here. In fact, you can see all that happens here on the thread visually, it is what's being shown here as a log. But I want you to understand this so you know where things are in case when things don't work, you understand where to find things, okay? So we have our add message here. The message was added. The role is user, because I am a user in this case, because I entered the message here, right? So going back, it is this message here, which is going to be sent to run. Very good. So that happened. Let me go ahead and close this. We added a message, and then we run the thread, right? It just did a post request. It has to have the assistant ID. What did I tell you? Because if you look at this diagram here, first you said assistant, the name, but internally it has to have the actual ID as well as the thread ID, which is exactly what's happening in the back end. If I close this thread here, let's see. You can see that has the response, and the response, each response has, of course, an ID, and the object is run, and when it was created, the assistant ID, as well as